Chapter 3 concerns sensation and perception, and we'll begin by discussing, first of all, the nature of sensation itself. What is sensation? Now, by definition, sensation is the activation of receptors that are located, first of all, in the eyes, the ears, skin, nasal cavities, and even on the tongue. Now, sensory receptors are also specialized forms of neurons. They conduct a process referred to as transduction, and transduction converts physical energy into electrochemical codes so that the brain knows what it is they should do with them. There are three different types of sensory systems, and each one of those systems performs a different function. Now, to begin, exteroceptors are sensory perceptors that collect data, as you might guess, from the external world. And there are two different types, distal and proximal receptors. Distal receptors include those associated with vision specifically. Objects rarely make direct contact with the eye. Rather, they're discerned at a distance. There's no need for any contact in order to experience the sensation. Proximal receptors, on the other hand, are associated with touch, taste, and possible smell. In most instances, proximal systems require direct contact with the stimulus. Thermal radiation does not always require proximity. You can tell that the sun is warm via your distal receptors without having to touch it. Enteroceptors are internal system monitors. They work to keep you aware of the internal workings of your body, such as letting you know when you're hungry, thirsty, experiencing pain, nauseated, fatigued, and so on. Now, proprioceptors are receptors that monitor the position of the body or the limbs relative to some reference point. They let you know where you are physically located in space. Proprioceptors are also found in the vestibular system, where they permit the maintenance of your physical position, in the pressure receptors of the skin, and in the muscle stretch receptors of your muscles, and in the joint movement receptors of your limbs. Now let's talk next about sensory thresholds specifically. There is what's called an absolute threshold. Absolute thresholds are the smallest amounts of energy that are needed for conscious detection of a stimulus at least half of the time. The just needed threshold is the point at which a stimulus is detectable at least half of the time it's present. Weber's law states that the just noticeable difference between two stimuli is always a constant. Sensory adaptation occurs when receptors stop responding to a constant stimulus, and subliminal stimuli are presented just below the level of conscious awareness. Now, the methods for establishing thresholds have a long history. It dates all the way back to the work of the original German psychophysicists. The first is called a method of limits, and the presentation of a stimulus that is clearly noticeable is followed by the presentation of increasingly weaker stimuli until observers are unable to detect a stimulus. Now, for example, using the method of limits to establish an auditory threshold might involve presenting a clearly detectable tone, followed by tones of decreasing amplitude until the participant reports hearing no tone at all. Now, this method then involves alternating trials of no detection with trials presenting increasingly stronger stimuli. Now, in our example, after establishing the lowest level of detection, tones of increasing amplitude would be presented. These descending and ascending series of trials are typically repeated several times with one constant observer. The method of adjustment, another method to observe stimuli, is when observers control the intensity of stimulus or of a stimulus until it's just barely noticeable. For example, a channel surfer who commandeers the remote control might turn the volume on the television set down until it's just barely audible. The distinguishing feature of this method is the self-adjustment by the one perceiving. Now, the method of constant stimuli is a technique that involves presenting a preselected set of stimuli in a random order to perceivers. The stimuli are chosen so that at least one is clearly below the sensory threshold, which is established previously, perhaps, by the method of adjustment, and at least one that is clearly above the sensory threshold. In a hearing test, for example, a set of tones of varying amplitudes might be presented to a perceiver at random, and the perceiver's ability to discriminate among them would be measured. Now we're going to take a look at vision. I'll describe for you a patient who we'll call PT, who was in his 30s and had experienced a severe stroke that affected his left hemisphere. Then, when he was in the hospital, he experienced another stroke that affected his right hemisphere. Although PT seemed to recover some from his stroke, the physical effects of the second stroke, which included dizziness, muscular weakness on the right side of his body, still he dragged his left leg slightly, but he was also completely unaware of it. Upon returning to his small family farm, he had difficulty readjusting to daily routines. Specifically, he had difficulty recognizing objects in space. He could not discriminate among cows, which is necessary for choosing which cows to milk. When noticeable, or most noticeable, was his inability to recognize faces, and that process is called visual agnosia. Even though he didn't even recognize the face of his wife. Furthermore, he knew that another's arms, legs, head, and body went together as a person. However, he could not recognize who that person was. He could recognize that his wife was moving across the room. That person was still his wife, thus maintaining some perceptual constancies. Interestingly, only his visual perception was impaired. He could readily recognize the sound of his wife's voice, and he could identify objects by touch or smell. For example, when presented with a candle, he reported that it was a long object. And when he was allowed to hold the candle, he labeled it as a crayon. And when he smelled it, he correctly identified it as a candle. Now we're going to take a look specifically at the parts of the eye. We'll talk about what causes afterimages, how dark and light adaptation will affect our vision, and how light energy is converted into messages in the brain. Now, for the structure of the eye, some of these parts are straightforward. Many of them you've most likely heard before. We have the cornea, the pupil, the lens, the retina, the fovea, bipolar cells, and rods and cones. Now, rods detect changes in brightness, and they function best in low levels of light. They're found everywhere in the retina except the center, what's called the fovea. Cones are sensitive to color, and they work best when the light is brighter. They're responsible for the sharpness of visual information and are found also in the fovea. Now again, when information is entering your eye, it's going to go through the cornea, which is a clear shield basically across the top of your eye. It moves through the pupil. It then flashes across the lens. It then is changed and then is reflected onto the retina, on the fovea. The bipolar cells and the other cells there determine which is what. Basically, that electrochemical information is sent through the optic nerve into the brain, and then the brain discerns what it is a person is looking at. Now, from the perspective of adaptation, dark adaptation is when rods and cones become more sensitive under lowered light. Light adaptation is when rods and cones become less sensitive under bright illumination. Now, to get from the eye into the brain, bipolar cells connect with ganglion cells. Ganglion axons form the optic nerve, which then exits through the blind spot on the fovea, or the retina. The optic nerve then crosses the optic chiasm on its way to both hemispheres of the brain. The occipital lobe contains the principal destinations of visual information. It features certain types of detectors like other specialized neurons, and then those receptors and other neurons decode that visual information. Now, color vision, of course, to understand that, we need to understand some properties of color itself, which include hue, saturation, and brightness. Colors are also adapted when we add colors, much like we would add colors to paint to change the color of paint, but with light, and with color vision specifically, we add different colors across different wavelengths of light. We can also subtract through the process called color mixing, which absorbs and then reflects just like paint does. Now, there is a trichromatic theory of color, which includes the three types of cones, which are red, green, and blue. The opponent process theory suggests that four primary colors, red, green, blue, and yellow, are present across the spectrum, and color vision then changes depending on how we adjust that color pattern. If you ever paid that much attention to a menu on a color TV screen, it will give you the opportunity to adjust those colors if you want, but you'll be dealing primarily with red, green, blue, and yellow. Now, when it comes to hearing, which is something very important to me because I am hearing impaired, it's important that you understand and know full well how all of those things work so that you even end up with the process of hearing. When it comes to the characteristic of sound, sound has three aspects. It includes pitch, which is also frequency, amplitude, which is volume or loudness, and the timbre, which is also referred to as the purity of the sound. From the structure of the ear, we have the pinna, we have the eardrum, the hammer anvil stirrup, the oval window, the cochlea-basilar membrane, the organ of corti hair cells, and the auditory nerve. There should be an image of some sort to that effect in your textbook. And then those things are all put together with specific neural connections. When we perceive pitch, we are referring to place theory, and that's where the location of the cells correspond to different pitches. Frequency theory suggests the speed of the basilar membrane vibration corresponds to different pitches as well. The volley principle suggests that neurons take turns firing to interpret these different sorts of pitch and timbre. Now, when it comes to hearing disorders, you can be partially impaired, you can be completely impaired, depends. There are a number of different techniques that you can use to help deal with various sorts of hearing difficulties. You can use hearing aids, which is what I do. You can have surgery, depending on what type of difficulty you have. You might also encounter cochlear implants. Those are some of the remedies that are available. I know of another young lady who was born with no ear canal. Correspondingly, she had no ear on that side of her head, so she heard nothing on that side. Now, over a period of time, they actually built for her part of an ear canal. A number of years later, they installed a cochlear implant for her. And what she could, quote unquote, hear on that side of her head was somewhat like a mechanical noise, a mechanical kind of like a robot voice in a way. While able to hear, it wasn't all that clear. But just suffice it to say that hearing technology has advanced in such a way that people can hear miraculously. And when it comes to the purchase of hearing aids, the old adage of you get what you pay for is very much in effect. You can buy relatively inexpensive hearing aids off the television for 3 easy payments of $19.95 plus shipping and handling, or whatever else you might want to pay. You would get a certain type of hearing aid, that's true. To what extent it would be helpful for you, that's undetermined. You can also spend into the tens of thousands of dollars for a set of hearing aids. My particular hearing aids are part of a new computer advancement phase of hearing aids. And what they do is that they function by themselves with surround sound. If I'm in a particular type of environment, my hearing aids will pick up the difference in the environment and turn off the surround sound and then focus my hearing to whatever is occurring right in front of me. I can adjust volume using my phone and an app on my phone, or I can adjust volume up and down based on a couple of buttons that are also on my hearing aids themselves. My hearing aids are advanced to the point that I worked in Montana for a couple of years recently, and if I had a challenge with one of my hearing aids, I could pick up my phone and call my hearing aid guy. The hearing aid guy lives in Wichita Falls, and he could adjust my hearing aids and tweak them, adjust them up, down, around, change programming, do whatever he wanted to do from his desktop here in Wichita Falls. Then he could turn my hearing aids off and turn them back on, and upload different programs to adjust whatever hearing difficulty I was having related to the hearing aid. There, again, are significant technological advancements taking place in hearing all the time. More times than not, in most cases, it will be even very difficult for you to notice that a person has hearing aids, much less that they're having to alter them in some way or other. I didn't realize how much I wasn't hearing until I started hearing it again. The day that they plugged in my first version of hearing aids, I asked the lady, I didn't ask, I screamed at her. Basically, I need you to turn it down. It was just way too loud. And she said, that's as low as it will go. She said, your brain has to relearn how to hear again. And it did, just took a little while. But I remember walking out of the doctor's office and hearing the pieces of gravel crunch underneath my feet. I hadn't heard that in an awful long time. I didn't realize I hadn't heard it until I heard it that day. So when people adjust their hearing with hearing instruments of any sort, it takes the brain a little bit of time to get a good feeling or to get a good sense of how those particular devices are going to work for them. Let's take a look, just for a few minutes anyway, at some of the other senses. Let's talk, for example, about smell. Smell is when we deal with olfactory receptors in the nasal passages and they receive molecules of a substance. In other words, we smell something, and when those smells are contained in molecules, and those molecules hit certain fibers and certain types of cells in your nose, and then those neural signals travel to the olfactory bulbs, which is right behind the frontal lobes. Then the brain interprets that information as whatever smell it happens to be, whether it's a flower or some other noxious fume that you might encounter. Taste, we're all familiar with that to some degree or other. We have taste buds on the tongue that receive molecules of substances. There are 5 basic tastes, including sweet, salty, sour, bitter, and what's called umami, or umami, depending on one's pronunciation. Smell and taste go together. If one is having difficulty with taste, it's quite likely that they will have difficulty with smelling, and vice versa. One of the significant challenges of late that deals with COVID-19 and their ability to diagnose COVID-19 besides the use of a test is that many patients lose their sense of taste and or their sense of smell. Sometimes neither one of them return, and other occasions both return quite well. When it comes to the kinesthetic is the word I'm trying to spit out. The kinesthetic sense basically refers to our sense of being able to move and navigate in space. It helps us understand our position and how it is we move our body. The vestibular sense is the body's sense of spatial perception. In other words, we have the ability, for example, when we're dizzy, as an example, the vestibular senses are out of kilter, and then we have trouble orienting ourselves in space, literally to the point that we may fall down. Motion sickness is explained by sensory conflict theory, which suggests then difficulties related to the spatial orientation a person is experiencing in any particular moment. We have skin senses, which include the perception of touch, pressure, temperature, and even pain. Process referred to as paradoxical heat provides a cooling example of these processes at work. We have pain, which we'll consider first of all what's called phantom limb pain, and that's when the brain recognizes itself to account for a missing limb. You often find it in individuals who have dealt with war and other types of conflict that have lost limbs. They will be convinced that whatever limb they may have lost is still very much there because it hurts. Well, what's happening is that it's referred to as a remnant in the brain, and the brain thinks to some extent or other that the limb is still there, and as a result, the brain interprets that electrochemical reaction as painful. Now, there is another theory about pain. It's referred to as gate control theory. And this theory suggests that there are receptors that are sensitive to pain, and that when those pain receptors are stimulated, a neurotransmitter called substance P is released into the spinal cord, and it activates other pain receptors by opening gates in the spinal column and sending the message into the brain. In other words, literally a gate in the spinal cord that opens and closes that allows for the exchange of electrochemical information. It often explains what's called the placebo effect, which helps us understand the effectiveness of various quote-unquote home remedies. Now, perception as an external tool, we have to understand that we need to look at what are called some Gestalt Principles. There should be some images in your textbook that refer to what's called a figure or the ground, proximity, closure, similarity, and continuity. Those particular aspects, there should be some images that help you understand distance and how similar sized objects may look larger or smaller depending on where they're placed in the foreground or in the background of a particular image. I went ahead and pulled my textbook to give you a couple of specific examples. If you look on page 108, you will look carefully at the picture of two individuals. If you look at the picture quickly, you will think that you see a picture of Al Gore and a picture of Bill Clinton. Look closely. What you'll discover on the left is that Bill Clinton's face has been superimposed onto Al Gore's body. When we look at them in a hurry, we'll see Al Gore. On the corresponding page to the right, you'll see that there are two trees listed or shown in a diagram with a little trail between them. Those trees are actually the same size on paper, but because of the tree's distance in the background of the picture, it appears to be at least somewhat larger. You'll notice the different sorts of textures that are related to an image of stone or different types of rocks and stones on the bottom of page 109. You can also see a figure in figure 3.31, which is also on page 109, some different pictures of how shadowing will influence our ability to see things. That gives you just a really quick notion of what it refers to as our perceptual organizational skill. But also remember that we basically see in what we call stereoscopic vision, which is the combination of using two retinal images to give us three-dimensional perceptions related to an experience. One thing you might also remember when it comes to perception, at least as it relates to sight, when an image moves into the eye, it goes through the cornea, through the iris, all that sort of stuff, and it goes through the lens, then it is changed there. And the lens alters the image onto the retina in a way that the retina sees it as upside down. In other words, when the information that you're interpreting as your computer screen looking straight at you, your eye is seeing your computer screen upside down. Now, the brain takes that electrochemical information and transposes it into a form that your brain can understand so that you see the object as upright. Other perceptual constancies will include size, shape, and brightness. Size constancy is the tendency to perceive objects as always being the same size, no matter how close or how far away they happen to be. Shape constancy is the tendency to perceive objects as remaining the same shape, even when the shape of the object changes on the retina of the eye. Brightness constancy is the tendency to perceive objects as a certain level of brightness even when the light changes. When we deal with perception of distance and depth, people have the ability to see in three dimensions. We have what we call monocular cues, which include interposition, linear, as well as aerial perspectives, elevation, texture gradients, shadowing, and motion parallax is what it's called. The binocular cues include convergent and what's called binocular disparity. Those pieces of information, again, are on page 108 and 109 in your textbook. When we're dealing with the location of sound, specifically, we have monaural as well as binaural cues that help us identify the source and location of sound. When we're looking at the perception of movement, we have what's called the Autokinetic Illusion, the stroboscopic motion, and the phi phenomenon. When we deal with visual illusions, Those are perceptions that do not correspond to readily or to reality, or are distortions of some visual stimuli. Now, a good example of something of this nature is when I'm in my office doing assessment, psychological assessment with individuals who think to some degree or other that they see things out of the corner of their eye. I always ask my clients, do you ever hear or see things other people don't? And sometimes they'll say, yeah, I see a cat or a large rodent or whatever else out of the corner of my eye, or I see a shadow of something moving along the floor on the wall. Now, that is what's called a visual illusion. The brain is playing tricks on the individual, and because of the quick movement of the eyes related to proximity as well as brightness and all the other issues related to sight and the ability to perceive things by sight, the brain interprets as seeing something that is not there. And the brain theoretically does see something that's not there. The challenge is to decide to what extent it either is or is not a hallucination. And in the majority of those cases is again referred to as a visual illusion and not an hallucination. Now, when it comes to observers and the characteristics they possess, an important idea to remember is that a lot of the things we quote unquote see are influenced by culture. For example, what's the motivation you have for looking at a particular object, or the emotion that you experience when you look at a specific type of information? What are the values you possess? The expectations you experience as part of your perception, your perceptual style, the experience of your own culture, as well as your personality. For example, my motivation to do a video for this class is because I need to do the video for the class. Whether or not you look at it is not the concern that I'm worried about. My concern is that I give you the information you require so that you can do the best you can for a particular exercise as well as for the entire course. So my motivation when it comes to my perception of things is my motivation's good. The emotions I feel, in all fairness, are relatively flat. It's something that's necessary for me to do. My values as a human creature, I value being integrous, telling the truth. There is not much of anything that I can't tell anyone as long as I tell it to them well. My expectations related to whatever I'm experiencing. If I want to go to a gymnasium for a volleyball game, first thing I'm going to do is not wear my hearing aids because loud whistles make my ears hurt, whether I have hearing aids in or not. My expectation of the gymnasium will be that it will be loud. As a result, my experience of the gymnasium is loud. Other people don't experience those things the same way I do because of my hearing impairment. I've often asked my face-to-face classes, do the people in India experience pain the same way people in the United States experience pain? Well, the short answer is sort of. All of the neurons and sensory organs and sensory cells necessary to perceive any sort of external or even internal stimuli are the same among human creatures. We all have the same parts, male and female. That's the way that rolls. But how it is the culture interprets that information will dictate to some degree or other what those people's experience of pain might be. Similar situations would occur as it relates to having cancer. Some people experience all kinds of adversity related to their cancer experience, depending on what type of treatment they encounter. Other people do not encounter the same sorts of difficulties, even though they might deal with a similar type of treatment. That involves one's expectation. How do we perceive things? The style that we perceive those ideas through is also important. And of course, your personality. What it is we think about ourselves as it relates to how we function. Do we have difficulties with our personalities? Those kinds of questions will come up much later in the term. Now, again, this is a scattershot, a real broad overview of sensations as well as perceptions as it relates to psychology. During these sorts of lectures and whatnot, if you want to look at it as a lecture, I will typically move relatively quickly because I'm not having an exchange of conversation in the classroom. If you have a specific question, be sure and send that to me either by email or you can post it on the discussion board. I'll see it there, and I'm happy to address it there as well. If I can help you with anything else before you get to Chapter 4, be sure and let me know.